Welcome everyone to our third climate change session. Today we're going to have the opportunity to get an inside look into translating global goals into climate action. We are joined by Rosalind, who is the Knowledge Exchange Officer at Oxford Net Zero. So please can you give me an opportunity to welcome her today with a round of applause.
Thank you, very generous. Now you may notice from my slides that it's not just Rosalind Chaston who's meant to be here. Alexis McGibbon sent her apologies. She's actually my boss at Oxford Net Zero. And to give you a little bit of context, I know you had Miles in session 1 who probably spoke about sort of climate science 101 kind of thing. Probably spoke about carbon take back. Yeah, he loves that one. Well, so back in the day when he came up with this scientific discovery that to limit global warming, we needed to net zero. A few years later, Oxford Net Zero as a research institute was established, and that's where I work. So we sort of sit physically in geography. Am I all right online, by the way? I can be heard. Fabulous. So we sort of physically sit in the School of Geography and the Environment, but obviously Mars is a physicist, we have social scientists, we have historians. One of our team made this beautiful graphic that you see on the left. So we're a very sort of interdisciplinary team, and Alexis, who was meant to be with us, is the head of the engagement and impact team. And I joined the team a couple of years ago, and I have the very sort of vague title of Knowledge Exchange Officer, which pretty much allows me to do whatever I feel is impactful at the time, which is an amazing job. Back in November, I was at the Brazilian COP. It was my first COP. It was quite the learning curve. It was very hot as well. And just as a bit of background, we're going to dive into the work, so I won't linger there too much. But in my spare time, I sort of spend a lot of time ocean rowing and exploring the world, that kind of thing. So, I mean, I'm not that far into I'm very much still an early career researcher. So I know not all of you are sort of undergrads, maybe master's students, maybe just here out of interest, but there's a lot happening in this space and there's a lot of work to be done from across disciplines. So I'm always very, very happy to chat. Knowledge Exchange Officer is exactly, I try to chat to people and exchange knowledge. So if anyone wants any sort of careers chats or to know things that are going on, I'll put my email up at the end and we can always chat. So, oh yeah, Alex, bad face. So we're going to start by sort of setting the scene, and I wanted to start with a little pop quiz. I know everyone loves Mentimeter, but would you mind, if you'd be so kind, bringing this up here? Because I know you've had Mars's lecture, What is Net Zero? But I think it's always important for us to revisit the scientific basis. Is that share? Okay. Okay. Is anyone on? Oh yeah, we started. Okay. Which gas is most responsible for climate change over 100-year timescale? Okay, amazing. Yes, all greenhouse gases. Methane, very much potent greenhouse gas, but it breaks down in the atmosphere. The key long-term driver of climate change is carbon dioxide because it does not dissipate from the atmosphere. It doesn't have a sort of half-life like methane does. And so over a sort of 100-year timescale and greater, it's the amount of CO2 that builds up in the atmosphere, essentially, that's causing our real problem. So when we're talking about climate action at different scales, we are talking about all greenhouse gases, but it's always important to keep in mind what action, what time scale, and which greenhouse gases we're tackling. Okay, number 2, this is a bit of a tricky one, and basically just guess. How many billion tons is the total estimated carbon budget to keep us within 2 degrees? Now, sorry for anyone who's voted already, but what I mean by this is the total carbon budget that humans can emit. So from pre-industrial levels to get us to 2 degrees. Oh, isn't this fun? Okay, so we've kind of got a cluster around the 4,000 billion tons, which is 4 trillion tons. Well, in fact, it's 1,000 billion tons or 1 trillion tons, which, all good? Okay, you can reposition me. Yeah, so 1 trillion tons. Now, crucially, this is carbon rather than carbon dioxide. So if you put sort of 3,700, 4,000 of carbon dioxide. Now, crucially, how many billion tons of carbon have we so far emitted? So you've got about 1,000 to play with to keep us within 2 degrees. Oh, I was right in there. Beautiful graphs. Okay, we have got a cluster around the right answer. It's about, to be honest, a lot of these things are quite difficult to say with confidence, because knowing how many tons of CO2 we emitted 200 years ago, you've got to do quite a lot of working backwards to get there. But it is about 700 billion tons, which doesn't take much maths to realise we're quite a long way there. Now, finally, before we get into it, I wanted to ask this question. Obviously, this is not a yes or no answer, but which sort of stakeholder along this axis do you think is most important in stopping global temperature rise? When I first made this, I put in all of the above, but I felt like that might be a bit of a cop out. So. Okay. Interesting. So mostly governments, individuals least important. Okay, very interesting. Let's get into it. So, theory. Okay, great. So as a quick sort of recap, this is basically Climate Science 101, and hopefully what you will have taken away from session 1. To stop the global average temperature from rising, and crucially all of the climate impacts this causes, we have to achieve net zero. And the amount of CO2 we release between now and achieving that state on a sort of global scale dictates how much temperature rise we will see. So net zero in itself is not a temperature goal. It's simply a description of the physical state where we stop temperatures rising. And this is very much a scientific understanding. It's born out of physics, it's born out of maths, and it's sort of been translated into international agreement. So this was the sort of the big moment, the Paris Agreement, you probably have heard of. And that kind of codified this concept of net zero into an international agreement. So to achieve a balance between anthropogenic emissions, that's just emissions by humans, by sources, and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of this century. And this is informed by the science. Obviously, politics comes into it. At the time, it had 196 signatories, now 195. But you can see it kind of built on this timeline of other international consensus agreements. So you had the sort of first IPCC assessment report. That's the kind of synthesis of all science, 1990, first UN climate change conference, 1995. And the science has developed to inform the international agreements. But the sort of key to this graph is what's coming up the y-axis, right? This is the emissions that have been happening whilst we've been making these international agreements. So the key is how we then translate this sort of globally agreed goal into actual implementation. Because at the moment, emissions are going up and up and up, despite the fact that we've set these goals. And what's really important to remember as we translate this is the fact that whilst the sort of temperature goals are very much informed by the science, and that kind of tracks quite well onto what our global carbon budgets are. That tells us how much carbon we can emit to more or less reach 1.5 degrees, more or less reach 2 degrees. Importantly, the more we emit, the less certain that science becomes. We get feedback loops, and so the sort of higher you risk it, the less these are informed by science as we understand it. Our uncertainty grows massively. But once we then translate these global carbon budgets into, okay, who should be doing what? What are governments doing? What are businesses doing? What are you and I doing? We get into all of these questions that draw on values, politics, economics, who should be responsible for this? How are humans who are already being impacted by the climate impacts being accounted for? And how do we incorporate justice and fairness and equity? It all comes into when you try and translate a goal into action. And this is kind of where our team operate, in this messy world of compromise, of imperfection, and of trying to get stuff done. Now, Oxford Net Zero, before I joined, wrote this paper, The Meaning of Net Zero and How to Get It Right. And I really, really recommend, it's sort of a humble plug, reading this, because it is pretty much the one-stop shop that lays out the principles that we as academics, and it was very much a collaborative paper, believe are important in this. So there's the sort of urgency of the zero, that's reducing things as quickly as possible. There's the integrity of the net, that's the bit where you're removing whatever your residual emissions are. And there's the consistency and alignment, as I would say, with sustainable development objectives. That's considering that we are operating in a human system that's very messy and very complex, and it cannot just simply be based on the physics and maths. And this is pretty much where our team gets involved. So we work to sort of ensure these principles across different scales of action. So this sort of triangle is indicative of how the global net zero goal is translated into NDCs. That's what nations commit to. Then that sort of filters down into how nations are then governing themselves into what we call like real economy stuff. So what are their specific sectors doing? What are the government operations doing? And then all the way down to sort of businesses, subnationals, their cities. And a lot of the action actually that I'm quite excited about is more down at this level. And we put the arrows in both directions because this is not a top-down thing. This is not a bottom-up thing. It's very much a messy mix of the two. And if there's sort of one takeaway from today, it's about how that kind of operates and some of the examples we've seen of where things are coming from the bottom up and where they're coming from the top down. And this is, of course, in the context, I'm doing a lot of setting the scene, so bear with me, I am going to get into the details soon. But this is, of course, with the realization that it is not just climate change that is the problem. I know you had the nature talk last week, and some of you may have seen this planetary boundaries model. I'm sure many of you will have done. And net zero is the physical solution we need to stop global temperature rising, but it's not the only challenge we're facing. So basically, it's very messy. It's very hard. And working in this field, you are essentially imperfect time and getting stuff wrong all the time. But through the process, we're hopefully moving in the right direction. Today, we're going to focus on sort of two case studies of work we're doing in this space, trying to translate global to local in a sort of high integrity way. And that's focused on businesses and governments. But I felt it was important to put this in, that the spectrum of climate action comes in many forms. And I know Alexis would have spoken more about this if she were here, because it's something she's very passionate about. But activism and climate action is driven by all these scales of people. So on the left, we've got Madeleine Sarr from Senegal, who was the first woman to lead the negotiations for the LDC group, the least developed countries in the UN international processes. They've been negotiating for 25 years, 20 years or so. And she became the first woman a couple of years ago to lead that group. Then sort of stepping down from the international, one sort of step down, you've got what my colleague Kaya Axelson calls the red pen activism. That's the sort of technocrats, the bureaucrats working to do the detailed work to try and change policies, to try and change businesses. That's probably the sort of camp that we as academics fit in. Then you've of course got the sort of more true activists or protesters who are really putting themselves out there for a lot of scrutiny and personal attack to drive the conversation. And whatever you feel personally about activism, there's some really interesting emerging academic work which is about how, by putting themselves and positioning themselves at quite a radical flank, it opens it's called the Overton window, but basically opens the window of conversation for the sort of more middle central policies. So you have that, and then it would be completely remiss to forget about the people who are actually on the front lines of this. So this was a group of the Wayorani people in Ecuador who were out on the front line and protected their forests against new oil mining in Ecuador, and they're very happy because they just won this. But for in 2019, I think it was 4 environmental and land defenders a week were killed. And so there's very much a spectrum here, but all of these people are driving climate action, and you need all of them doing it to get stuff done, which hopefully will become clear. Any questions at that stage, or shall I dive in? Let's dive in. Basically, stop me anytime. But we're going to start by going quite technical on what does credible climate action look like for businesses. Now, the sort of good news in this often very ungood newsy world is that net zero targets are rising rapidly. Since the Paris Agreement, it's been just over a decade now, and we've seen this groundswell of people, organisations, governments saying they're going to achieve net zero. This is from some work by the Net Zero Tracker, which we're involved in, who track commitments both by governments and by businesses. And again, this is just the same thing, but you can sort of see how rapidly this has been growing. Apologies, these are Alexis, so just bear with me. But the kind of goal here is that, you know, more and more companies are committing to science-based climate targets, despite this sort of narrative of rollback. And for sure that is there. But I think what's particularly interesting is that the growth of these are not necessarily, you know, confined to US and Europe, Western. So Asia is actually the fastest growing region of science-based targets, which grew 134% in 2024. There's also evidence, this bottom one, that actually these matter. So companies that are setting these plans are proving that ambition pays off. So they are decarbonising faster than the companies that aren't. So it's not just accidental, it's not just lip service. But the question is, what happens when companies set these targets? Because that's where the kind of governance system kicks in. We need rules. At the moment, we have what Antonio Guterres called a surplus of confusion and a deficit of credibility. So you may have heard these terms being bandied around. You've got net zero, carbon neutral, climate neutral, green, sustainable, pretty much any others. And targets do matter. Companies that set targets tend to be reducing their emissions more, but credibility hinges on defining what good net zero actually looks like for companies, which is not so easy to do. This is just a funny photo that I find. So, you know, a lot of net zero targets are accused of being a bit like this. Man announces he will quit drinking by 2050. That's fine. What about the next 24 years, right? This was quite an interesting paper that came out. It was exactly about this kind of problem of companies setting targets but not being held accountable to them. And its kind of headline was, you know, limited accountability and awareness of corporate emissions target outcomes. And the big finding was that this 31% more or less of companies that set pledges, quietly they were deleted before they'd reached them. And this is obviously very concerning, but I mean, if 31% aren't, 61% are, right? And so what Alexis kind of argues is that we're actually seeing a moment of quiet progress and delivery by many, if not every, company who are already engaged in this kind of issue. And we're seeing sort of internal momentum, and we are seeing early investment in the kind of long-term things that we know we need to reach. But there's definitely a need to make sure that when a company says they're going to do something, they actually are. Because what this paper found was that companies kind of gained reputational reward saying they're going to do something, and then there's absolutely no consequence when they just slowly drop it. It gets later. So I've been speaking for a long time, and hopefully I've set up this problem of what does it mean to set a net zero target as a company? What does it mean to set a net zero plan as a company? So just take a couple of minutes amongst yourselves to talk. If you're online, maybe shove something in the chat. But imagine you're working for a multinational company. You're at, you know, Amazon, Unilever, Google, whatever, and you've been asked to set a target and a plan for achieving net zero by 2050. What kind of things are you including in that? Go. Right. Any volunteers, or shall I? Shout out. What would you be including? Carbon dioxide emissions, perhaps. Huh? Green energy plans? Okay, cool. Yeah. Targets within time frame. Would you have just one target or? Uh-huh. Okay, multiple targets with a clear plan. How you get to each stage. Yeah. Breaking it down by nation because you're a multinational. Yeah. Very difficult because, I mean, as in, this is exactly it. You know, if a multinational company is set in one country who's got quite strict regulation, they maybe operate in a country that haven't. Yeah, Rebecca. Longitudinal monitoring with independent oversight. Yeah, love the independent oversight. Okay, two more. Yeah, supply chain management. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. SMEs in other countries, supply chain management, crucial. One more. Go. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very nice. So internal audit, where exactly in your company are your emissions coming from and working back there. Incredible. Now, this may sound sort of fairly obvious, right? Companies should be able to do this, a lot of people think, but it's only 10 years ago that the concept of net zero was encoded into this international agreement, right? And so it's not so easy to translate that automatically into guidance for companies of rapidly different scales. We've got SMEs, we've got multinational companies, we've got companies in different sectors, and it does kind of work differently. And the team, again, before I joined, but came up with this sort of rubric of a simple acronym to score company net zero strategies. And these were the kind of areas and criteria that people were beginning to look at in the sort of few years following Paris. So they are, I think we've had most of them actually. So short-term plans and actions, that's exactly this sort of interim targets, they call it. But, you know, it's fine to say you're going to get to net zero by 2050 or even a reduction by 2050, but you've got to have plans and a clear roadmap for how to get there. Coverage of all gases across all scopes, setting a sort of climate strategy that just deals with methane is not going to cut the mustard. Cut the mustard, is that a phrase? That's very colloquial, sorry. Now offsetting, used scarcely and with conditions. So Miles probably hammered home this idea that there are going to be residual emissions, but that is not an excuse for not reducing your emissions yourself. And we can talk more about offsetting if people are interested in it, but the kind of ongoing idea is that you're basically reducing 90% of your emissions by 2050, and that sort of residual 10%, which if you can reduce them, which a lot of companies actually can, go ahead. If you're a company with a very, you know, dependent on high temperature processes, it is very difficult to reduce your emissions. So perhaps you have removals. And the key also is that you're scaling up those removals between now and the net zero target date, right? You're not just going, oh, in 2050, we're going to buy 10 gigatons of removals. You've got to price that into your company as you go on. Reporting and accountability. So I think we've had that, the idea of being transparent about what you're doing, and equity for workers, local and global impacts. It sounds quite self-explanatory. Fewer than 7% of companies who were monitored by the Net Zero Tracker met these criteria in 2025. And to an extent, that's because a lot of companies feel that this guidance isn't well established enough. You know, we've got these global goals, but what does it actually mean for me in my sector? It's a very emergent thing. And this is from some work that Alexis and some colleagues did on mapping. There's a lot of guidance that exists out there, which looks quite fractured. You know, this is kind of a sort of alphabet soup of initiatives. But what they found, which was quite encouraging from this research, is that even though there's sort of what they call institutional fragmentation, so they've got a lot of different organizations in space, the actual what they're saying was becoming increasingly based on consensus. So there was a lot more agreement than disagreement among all these voluntary initiatives. That's not to say that the guidance is perfect. There are a lot of gaps to remain, but there are a lot of gaps remain, but there are a lot of people working on them, and we'll show in a minute how these ideas come into the system. But you know, impacts on nature. If we're allowing offsets, are we having nature-based solutions? Are we having carbon credits to offset? What's the impact on nature if we haven't got high integrity? Justice and equity is obviously a massive one. At the moment, standards include very limited guidance on just transition, both in terms of their own workforce, but also impacts elsewhere. And this is one that, if Alexis were here, she would be raving about, because this is her kind of baby, is the service emissions. So at the moment, how we have developed a system where we count carbon for companies, things like consultancy firms and very inventory of emissions, so how we count them, for a consultancy firm, for an advertising firm, for a legal firm, are not really accountable. So it looks like they have very small emissions when, for example, they might be investing billions of pounds in fossil fuel companies. You might be McKinsey telling a fossil fuel company where to dig, how to lobby for the license, how to market it. You're doing everything except getting the apple out of the ground, and you can sort of claim that you're not neutral. So this is kind of a gap in the ecosystem that Alexis is very much working to solve. So the Service Emissions Hub is an initiative she's working on. But despite these sort of gaps, what we're seeing, and bear with this diagram because I think once you've got your head around it, it's a very interesting way of seeing how things are coming kind of from the bottom up. So we've had this sort of strong voluntary initiatives. We've had companies, you know, you might have heard of B Corp, so certain companies signing on to strong voluntary initiatives. You've got ERI, you've got other things that basically put self-limitations on companies. They say, we're gonna all collectively, there's 10 of us, and we're gonna achieve a climate goal by 20, whatever. And from that kind of rapid NGO-driven, very energetic, experimental frontier of best practice, you started having these sort of orchestration campaigns. So out of the United Nations, there was this group called Race to Zero, which was basically for the non-state actors, that's basically anyone who's not a state. And it drew on the criteria from all these strong voluntary initiatives. And it created this sort of set of criteria to say, okay, this is what most people are saying is best practice for a company. And what we're seeing now is all of this work is getting formalized into standards. And when we say standards, what I mean here is an international agreed standard. Has anyone heard of ISO? Yeah, vaguely. I mean, they regulate everything from computers to plug sockets to lights to ships. And it's the International Organization of Standards. And what they're doing this year is developing a standard, what it means for a company to be aligned to net zero. And this is a really sort of critical moment because ISO standards are used around the world by governments. they can very much be put into regulation, and they very much are put into regulation. And crucially, they have a system of what they call quality infrastructure, which I never quite know what it means, but it is basically a system of independent verifiers or auditors who exist to audit companies against an ISO standard. And by developing the sort of ISO standard, which is happening at the moment, it means that you've got a internationally agreed definition of what a company looks like when it's working towards net zero. But crucially, that is only possible because of all the work that happened down here as a sort of groundswell from all these targets after Paris. It very much has worked its way up. And 2026 is really the critical year. So these are sort of some of the names. But why it's so exciting is because by the end of the year, we will have clarity and international agreement for the first time on what good looks like. Companies. And that is very impactful because it means for the first time we can hold companies accountable. Them saying, oh, we can't do something because, you know, the definitions aren't there, the guidance isn't there, we're not sure, we don't want to be held legally liable for saying we're green when we're not. A lot of companies are afraid of, you know, things that they are genuinely trying to do playing out very badly in the media, often because they're also doing naughty things that should be played out badly in the media. But this is very much a pivotal moment. And so to kind of summarize how this story, this journey has happened, is that net zero as a sort of scientific concept happened 2008-9 was the paper, and it sort of worked its way from the sort of science, the academia, into this international Paris Agreement. We then have this rapid mobilization with all these voluntary initiatives saying, okay, you know, we put this into international legislation. What does this mean in practice? A lot of people were very much experimental getting it right. There were also a lot of experiments that went wrong. And over the last couple of years, and hopefully summing up this year, is how this has sort of from this sort of bottom up energy started to be formalized into standard. But what's next? You remember that graph of the emissions going up and up and up despite these international negotiations? And so the key now is to implement. So what Alexis and the team are very excited about is as these standards come out for businesses, let's roll them out. Let's see how businesses are actually taking them up, which I won't delve in too much geopolitically at the moment. Quite difficult. But we look back to that kind of pie chart where I said the greatest growth at the moment is in Asian companies. Asian companies. A lot of African companies are pioneering some of this work, and there are kind of bits in the standard that apply differently to companies based in different locations because of various capacities, various responsibilities. That's where the equity work is coming in. And the goal is sort of by 2050, we have this system where companies are actually achieving the targets that they set out to. Questions? Do you guys think companies should be able to offset? Buy carbon credits to offset? Not within the current system of carbon crediting. Yeah. If they, sorry, say that again. If they, okay, what, so as in they've done the reductions already? Okay, yeah. Rebecca? Oh yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. That's a great question. So actually, I suppose those online can see it. Basically, fewer than 7% of companies are reaching score. Does that mean companies are failing, or does that mean the sort of integrity, or the score framework is misaligned with reality? What I would say to that is the ISO standards and the SBTI standards are significantly higher integrity, more formalized anyway, than this kind of score rubric. The score rubric it's a fantastic kind of thing to remember whenever you're looking, if you spend your Saturdays reading corporate transition plans like I do, it's a sort of good peace of mind. But actually the standards that are being formalized at the moment are hopefully going to be a lot higher integrity and certainly a lot more detailed than that. So you could argue, well, companies aren't going to be able to achieve that, but crucially, there's a lot of private sector representation in the negotiations that are going on. So you have company representatives, have energy industry representatives, you have heavy industries from Western economies, from emerging economies, and it is a consensus agreement. So consensus does not mean unanimity. I would say unanimity. Thank you. Been a long week. It means there is no sustained objection, and so there's sort of negotiation. The standards are not going to be perfect, but there is a lot of private sector representation, and so I would say no, it's not a failure in the score framework and in the standard. I think I was at a talk last night about, it was government target making actually, and this guy said a target should always be just out of reach. And a lot of issue companies have is they consider it their scope 3 emissions. So they're often very happy to decarbonize what they directly emit. So, they've got a building, they have heating and lights on it. That's pretty easy to decarbonize. The technology exists. Where they have a lot of objection is in, I think you mentioned the supply chain, right? So what happens to the products when they go to the consumer? You and I are the ones who buy oil and gas. We're the ones who burn it. Should a fossil fuel company be held responsible for that? Often they would say no. But the kind of work that's been going on has been to sort of define what companies can influence in their scope 3. And so, I mean, I can't say exactly what the standards will result in, but I'm hopeful that they will be difficult companies to reach, but very much not impossible. Any other questions generally about companies? Yeah. Yeah. Great question. So the question is, if a company does not achieve its commitment, what's the kind of repercussion of that? At the moment, nothing, basically. You could, and the reality is that a lot of companies have set targets that maybe are slightly more ambitious than they'll achieve. Certainly, a lot of company plans depend, and this is what we're going to come into in the second half, on depend on systems change, right? So a company says, oh, we're going to have completely electric vehicles. They require the EV infrastructure to be there for them to be able to meet that target. And in some companies, a lot of sort of policy is rolling back. And so I do have sympathy with companies not being able to meet their targets, but if they make 80% of the progress towards the target, that's better than them not trying in the first place, I would say. And the other thing on that is, it's not everyone's goal, but I think along that conveyor belt, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that companies would be sort of regulated to do this. And then you could, the design of the ISO standard is that it's auditable. So if it did come into regulation, a company could then face consequences, sort of government set consequences for not meeting that standard, like they would if they're an electricity provider not meeting an ISO standard for something else. So you can have fines on that. Do you think they should? Yeah. 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 I think there's also interesting ways to design it to not penalize companies straight away. So, you know, saying, okay, you haven't met this year's interim target. In order for you to stay, you know, within our science, so the Science-Based Targets Initiative, for example, in order for you to be able to keep the badge, you have to, whilst you get back on track, do a sort of contribution to climate finance, that kind of thing. So there are sort of ways and means of allowing a little bit of leeway and getting back on the path. But yeah, interesting. Okay, we will move on to what you guys seem to think was the most important factor in all this. What can governments do? Oh, I've got another mentee today. You tell me, what can governments do to promote climate action? Got it? Okay. Legislation and regulation. Community schemes, fines and penalties, education, enforcement, educate, auditing schemes, subsidies, audits, carbon credits, yeah. Adopt interoperability. Who put that? Very standardsy language. I like that. That means that's a lot of the work we do. It's interoperability. So basically, you've got a million, you know, standards that companies are trying to keep. Let's make sure that they're not saying directly contradictory things, right? Incentives, target progress, strict policies, carbon tax, lead. Yeah, a lot, someone said. Nice. Climate justice. Okay, very interesting. Hopefully by the end of this section, there will be some other words up there too. Okay, so, and again, stop me anytime if you have any questions. You guys are very quiet. I know it's rainy and bleak outside, but please interrupt me at any time. So a lot of the words we had on this sort of word cloud were very much how governments are key players in shaping how the system operates. So they're the ones setting the regulations, the legislation, they're doing the audits, they're setting the carbon taxes, etc., etc. And the work that I'm doing at the moment, or one of the projects I'm doing at the moment, is in partnership with the Oxford Climate Policy Monitor. So you have the Net Zero Tracker, which is kind of, it does do government targets as well, but it's a little bit more company focused. The Climate Policy Monitor is a big data set tracking climate policies from governments. And these are sort of 5 of the sections, the policy domains that they track. So they track climate policies and regulations across 37 jurisdictions, which the jurisdictions they choose cover over 85% of emissions and 87% of global GDP. So it's a lot of the emissions in the world. And similar to the Net Zero Tracker, they kind of rate policies on various parameters, which are ambition. So they're policies that they consider to be aligned with the Paris temperature goals of well below 2 degrees. Stringency, so that's exactly what you guys kind of come to, which is whether regulations are enforced, whether they're mandatory, which, by the way, you know, not everyone thinks they should be, and that's a very, I think it's interesting that often we sort of come to regulation and mandatory regulation, but it's very much not a universal perspective, which hopefully we'll get to in a moment. Implementation, so if the rules are actually being operationalized, and comprehensiveness of the targets. So are we just saying, you know, farms have to not use this kind of fertilizer, or are we actually looking at the entire economy? And these are the sort of areas that they're looking at. So disclosure, how many emissions do you have? That's not saying a company has to do anything about them. That's just really the sort of first step. How many emissions do you have? I think you came to this point of the first step of doing anything about it, knowing what you're emitting and where. Transition planning. Now this is very much coming more into the what's your plan to reduce emissions. Green prudential rules, which is anything to do with how financial risks related to climate are being managed. So that's targeting more banking, investment, finance. Then 2 new domains, methane abatement specifically, and rules around carbon credits. And again, some pretty good news. You know, we have this international agreement, and actually nations are taking up policies that are climate focused. We've seen significant growth, both in the number of policies and in their ambition stringency. And again, challenging this narrative that we sort of see in the press. It's not just Europe. The biggest growth is in fact elsewhere, and we're seeing a lot of countries. I mean, every single country bar one is seeing continuous progress and uptake of policies. Any guesses which the one is? Yeah. It could be America, yeah. The United States are the only country that the climate policy monitors have registered significant rollbacks in. And these policies, coming back to that sort of, oh yeah, please, love a question. Okay, the question is, how do you navigate companies moving their operations to other countries with less stringent regulations? With difficulty, I would say. So there are some things like carbon CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which the European Union have a version of and the UK have a version of, which is essentially trying to account for this. So it's saying if we're requiring certain carbon emissions of these and products in our jurisdictions, anything that we're importing is being taxed to sort of meet the difference. So with things like that, but it's a very good question because it is very difficult to do. Did that answer the question? Yeah. Okay. And yeah, so coming back to that sort of conveyor belt earlier of how action is kind of coming along the spectrum, governments will often draw upon the standards that have been developed in that conveyor belt of voluntary initiatives into orchestration campaigns and into formal standards. So this was some incredibly messy mapping work that I did in my first week in the job, when I didn't know what any of these acronyms meant. And so I was just looking for the letters TCFD with no actual understanding of what they meant. But TCFD is a disclosure regulation, and SBTI I spoke about is this science-based targets. That's more how companies actually do something. ISO have a whole suite of standards, but the kind of point to get here is that governments aren't doing things by themselves. They're drawing on stuff that other people have done, right, and putting that into their regulation. Sometimes just referencing them, sometimes requiring them. And so, you know, if we come back to this idea of net zero companies, it's not impossible to see a system where they are required in regulation to achieve net zero. But I mean, hands up in the room who thinks that would be a feasible thing. Say in the UK, in 10 years' time, the companies are required to set net zero targets. Okay, cool. I like it. Yeah, I mean, it's possible, but clearly it's going to take a lot of time, right? And the idea that that will be a universal thing, questionable, I would say. So what other levers do governments have? If they're not just shaping the market, what else can they do? And this takes us to the final debate that I want to spend a little bit of time on today, the climate policy monitor tracks, which is public procurement. So governments are not just market shapers, they are significant market participants. And the reason I wanted to speak about this in particular is because I think it's demonstrative of climate action, which is kind of being driven in the opposite direction. So with the company stuff, you've kind of got this bottom up groundswell. With this, as we'll see, it's kind of a little bit more meeting in the middle. The really exciting thing about public procurement as well, and I know I sound like a massive policy government nerd when I say this, is that it's slightly less politically contentious, right? For a government to set public procurement legislation, they're not saying what you as do, they're saying what we with our money are doing. And so in that way, it's something that can kind of develop even when we have political headwinds. And for those who don't know, public procurement is just government spending on goods and services. So anything from healthcare, roads, food, vaccines, personal protective equipment, pretty much anything you can think of, I reckon a government of some scale buys it. And so this is an enormous sort of power. And it's really big business. So public procurement accounts for $13 trillion annually. 10 trillion of that is spent by just 16 countries. It's between 13 to 20% of global GDP. I know that's quite a big range. It's quite difficult to count. 15% of annual global emissions directly linked to public procurement. And interestingly, fewer than 2.8% of public contracts are openly published. So we're requiring companies to do all this sort of reporting and transparency and disclosure. Some countries have very open public procurement, some don't. Does anyone just for a moment know what this is at the top right? Boat. It is an aircraft carrier, yeah. So this is the HMS Elizabeth, which is bigger than the Houses of Parliament. Any ideas of how much it costs? Throw it out there. $7 billion. Well, yeah, not bad. £3 billion. It was £6.5 billion for her and its twin. So this is sort of big business for one boat, right? I've actually rowed past it in a tiny little rowing boat, so I wanted to do a little shout out to that. But the point is, governments are spending a lot of money and they have a lot more control over how they use it. And you spoke about supply chain engagement, and I completely agree. This is, to me, probably the most exciting arena of climate action for companies and businesses anyway. And the key is that public procurement is different to private procurement, right? So if you're a private company, your fundamental goal, realistically, is shareholder value. If you're a company with shares. And often, you know, you'll have a CEO who's in place, what, a couple of years, 5 years, 10 years, maybe 20 years. A government is going to be buying concrete, it's going to be buying fuel, food, it's going to be buying fuel, it's going to be buying cars, it's going to be buying cement for decades, we hope, apocalypse aside. And crucially, public procurement has to serve public value. And so that can include things like public health, like amenity, these sort of things that, you know, private companies can care about, but it's a lot more difficult to make that case when they're fundamentally a profit driven machine. And this is a quote from one of the interviews we did. So as a private firm, it would be hard to build in those public benefits, but as a public sector organization, you can build them in fact. That's what the government advice in managing public money requires you to do. Yeah, please. Okay, so the question is, having a government being both a market shaper and a market participant, or setting the regulations and being players with the game, can that affect accountability? Accountability of what? I mean, yes, for sure. And obviously corruption in public procurement is quite a big thing. And there's a very fine line. So in company action, we're often talking about like supply chain engagement. So basically going to talk to your suppliers and saying these are the kind of products we want. This is how we want you to behave. Governments, as we will come to in a moment, actually, are very highly restricted in what they can do. So there are very strict sort of competition laws. They have to follow very strict procedures. A lot of in the UK, there was like a lot of sort of controversy over the contract, so COVID personal protective equipment, because there was a feeling that it wasn't being done in a transparent way. I mean, there wasn't a feeling it wasn't being done in a transparent way. So yes, but I would say the system that exists to kind of protect against that, crises aside, is generally pretty certainly in the UK. Cool. Anyone else? I know I'm going super technical into business net zero, but climate action. Yeah. Please. Yeah. So is there of the United States rolling back, you mean? Are there things other countries can do? Yeah. So the question is there anything that international community can do to kind of mitigate, to use a climate term, the rollback and the United States basically going drill. Yes, but it's very much a balancing act. I think what's interesting about the United States is after the first time they left the Paris Agreement, there was this big campaign called We Are Still In, which was led by subnationals. So there were cities, there were states, there were companies who very publicly sort of said, we are still in. And so the idea was, okay, our nation is not committed to the Paris Agreement, we are. And so internally, I think there are things that can be done. It's a lot harder this time because there's a lot of genuine fear and sort of righteous fear because people are being taken to court. Companies are facing significant. Have you heard green hushing? So you've heard of green washing, which is, you know, companies saying they're doing stuff when they're not. Green hushing is companies staying very quiet about what they're doing because they don't want to face the consequence. I think there's kind of hope to be gained. Again, I know you said international, so I'll come to that. But in terms of there's hope to be gained that a lot of companies, like, they want to do trade with other countries, right? And so in terms of what international community can do is kind of carry on, right? You know, Asian countries are seeing a lot of growth in climate policies. The European Union is a massive trade bloc. And, you know, we're facing our own problems in the European Union. But companies do want to do trade there. You know, the biggest companies in America are global companies. And so basically carry on with the realism that you also have to not go so far that you're sort of opening yourself up to, well, we're all opened up to terrorists, basically, what we do, right? Yeah, I think you have to be diplomatic, but carry on with whatever you were doing anyway. Does that answer your question at all? A little bit. Let me think on that. I'll come up with something more. Anything else? Yeah. Please. Yeah. Yeah. So the United States are the only ones who have withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. Yeah. And I mean, here we're really like coming into the real sort of fragility, right, of the international system. I mean, the United States haven't just left the Paris Agreement, they've left most United Nations bodies. So the UNFCCC is the climate change one. They've also sort of left, you know, OCA, the humanitarian one. They sort of really pulled themselves out of everything, and it's kind of unprecedented. Like, the international order is built on law, but we're seeing the sort of limitations of that law, right? I don't know if I have a better answer than, I think 5 years ago people would have probably said, or not 5 years ago, 10 years ago people would have probably said you can't, but we are seeing it now. I think, again, it's for me a drive for other people to step up with leadership, without being sort of stupid and putting their own countries at sort of international risk. We need to see stuff getting done. And I mean, also there is a genuine argument, and there's evidence that actually oil and gas, certainly for electricity, is just much more expensive. Like, it makes economic sense, right? And so we are seeing progress, and I think investing in the technology and continuing that way is really the way to do it when the international system is becoming so shaky. Public procurement. And yeah, so through our research, we kind of have found various approaches that governments are doing this. And bear with me through the sort of technicalities of this, but we're sort of seeing the trifecta of like the what, who, and the how of public procurement. So basically, governments have these three levers. So the what is exactly this kind of thing of saying, oh, we're only going to buy things like this, right? So you might have heard of eco labels, or if you buy paper, it sort of says FSC on it. That's the Forestry Stewardship Council. If you buy fish, there's the Marine Stewardship Council. There's a lot of stewardship councils, and these are the sort of private initiatives that develop eco labels. You also have governments who have eco labels. So the EU have their own eco label. Korea have minimum green standards, and that's basically saying, as a government, we are only going to buy recycled paper, or we are only going to buy electricity from renewable sources. This kind of thing. You also then have the who. Who are you buying from? Oh, and in the middle, this is kind of the process that happens when government's buying something. So there's defining what they need to buy. There's putting it out to tender, saying we want to buy this. There's selecting who they're going to buy from. There's then setting up the contracting, and then there's evaluating the success of that contract. So again, onto that question online of how are we sort of preventing, the rule setters making themselves exceptions. There's a very sort of well-established process of government procurement. And this who is exactly pulling from Alexis's section earlier of, we're only going to buy from companies, for example, who have an ISO net zero standard. That's obviously a few years away, but at the moment, the UK, so the NHS require, if they're purchasing from a company and they're purchasing more than £5 million worth of anything, that company has to have a carbon reduction plan. Canada have a similar thing, and crucially, this is something that exists in the absence of other regulations. So the UK do not require all companies over a certain size to have a carbon reduction plan, but through using their own money, they can set that stipulation. There's also, I think, this area of sort of who you're buying from is also where you come in to bring in questions of sort of justice and other priorities. So, for example, South Africa have procurement tender decisions that give higher weight to companies that are majority owned by historically disadvantaged groups. So you can bring in all these sort of other priorities, this alignment with other sustainable development goals. Yes, please. Yeah, well, I would say, I mean, that figure I had up earlier, $13 trillion is global procurement. It's 20% of global GDP. So, like, it's not everything, but it's a lot. And I think what's particularly interesting about public procurement is I completely hear you, but it's also setting the kind of market direction, right? It's got the ability to de-risk investments. Google say, oh, we want to buy loads of this product, but at the moment it's just too risky for us. We can't take it on. Governments don't have that short-term perspective, right? They can do something over 20 years, and they can find the investments that companies tell them they want to make, but currently can't. And so I hear you, it's not everything, but 20% of GDP is quite a substantial amount. You wanna? Okie dokie. And then the sort of final aspect of this, and this is the kind of most innovative part, is on the contracting side. So governments can procure services rather than products. So we're seeing some examples of a government saying, you're going to be our lighting provider. We're not going to buy lights off you, we're buying lighting. And that then provides an incentive for the company to do it in a much more efficient way so that their costs are less, their profits are higher. And this was kind of the insights from this research, that basically governments are effectively using all three of these approaches. And there's a real preference for these eco-labelling schemes because exactly what you're saying, sort of outside impact of this, they're sending very clear policy signals of the direction of travel that the government is going, which is really enhancing market readiness. Crucially, and I think this is the biggest one at the moment, is that green public procurement does not need other private regulation in order to exist in and of itself. And it can be sort of synergistic with other climate rules, but it doesn't need it. And so in a time where we're facing, backlash and certainly a lot of political questioning over the sort of net zero agenda, if you like to use that term, these are things that can be going on in the background and actually putting money into the solutions that we need to scale, and can be aligned with those broader sustainability goals. There's a lot of priority of like local buying and other priorities that come in alongside the climate action. Okay, I've been talking for a long time, so we'll take a couple of minutes. This is kind of bringing it very much to the local. You're in charge of purchasing food for all the schools in Oxfordshire. Is anyone actually from Oxfordshire? Yeah? Cool, me too. What school did you go to? You live here? Oh, okay. Okay. Anyone? Yeah? Yeah? What school did you go to? Okay. What was the food like? Yeah. Mine was mostly chips and then I remember turkey. Yeah. Very healthy. Anyway, not very public value. So take a couple of minutes amongst yourselves. How could you use your purchasing power as a subnational government, you're running Oxfordshire, to create public value with particular focus on it? Okie dokie. Any suggestions? What are you gonna do? You're the government, you've got all the power, all the money, well, some money. How are you gonna use it? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Okay, so for those online, buying local food to sort of reduce transportation emissions and presumably costs, um, and wondered whether the Oxford congestion charge was to do with emissions. Now, that's probably the most political statement I could get involved with. I believe their position is that it's to reduce road traffic for health and safety. Take that as a anyone else? Yes, please. Right. So buying more plant-based food and organic for the sort of biodiversity public value in that sense. Yeah. Investing was. Oh, cool. Yeah. Uh-huh. And you could also, rather than just requiring investment in it, or sort of rather than just investing in it, you could put that into a contract, right? So a certain percentage of food waste is having to be farmed into these initiatives, right? Okay. And so this is kind of the deep dive that I'm working on at the moment, which is exactly on food. And the reason I wanted to sort of get into this, and I know it's taken a lot of sort of setup with public procurement stuff, but is that whilst we had this conveyor belt for the climate action for businesses working sort of from the ground up, this I think is an example where it's much more meeting in the middle. So the UK government, the most recent Labour UK government, came into power saying, you know, we want public procurement to be more strategic, and they've led sort of reviews and they've led consultations into public procurement, but it was very much a manifesto promise. So their statement, I'll read it for you, is at the heart of our public service reform is the transformation of public procurement. With the UK's annual £385 billion spend on goods, works and services, procurement is not merely a function, it is a powerful lever for national renewal. We want people around the UK to feel this government spend through investment in their skills and opportunities to access high quality jobs. Do you reckon I do a better or worse job? Ouch. So this is sort of big government priority, right? You know, these are big words. They want public procurement to be this lever for action. Currently, I think it's fair to say the system isn't quite living up to that ambition, and there's a lot of work to be done, but they are sort of putting the effort in. There's this big public procurement review funded by the government, finding these opportunities. And the key in the sort of food system and others is these government buying standards which exist. So these are things that had already existed, so at the sort of top scale of that conveyor belt, if you like. Sadly, you know, they're not perfect. One interviewee called them woefully inadequate, which was a bit of a damning indictment, but I think the governments are quite aware of this. Fortunately, for this top-down priority, public procurement has not been the priority of previous governments, but in the meantime, all of these sort of lower scales were cracking on. They were doing work. So there were pilot projects in schools. So the Hackney School food pilot, 2 primary schools, there was a local chef. He was trying to get, I think it's 30%. Yeah, introducing organic fruit and veg of at least 30% weight of each meal into every single meal in the meals of these primary school kids. And this was sort of a very much a small scale pilot project, but it was beginning to produce some evidence, both of how much this was costing to do, but also how much public value, how much public benefit it was having on these kids. And there are so many of these. I've sort of put 2 up here, but there are so many. And you also have this great kind of orchestration campaign and very much voluntary standards. So it's not a sort of governmental standard, but this Food for Life Served Here program, and it was done by an NGO, the Soil Association, and it's kind of this bronze, silver, gold standard for how schools can go about buying better food, both for health, but also for carbon emissions and biodiversity. And this pilot study in Nottinghamshire County Council found that for every £1 spent, it returned £3.11 in social, economic, and environmental value. So, whilst the government didn't have it on their agenda, all this work, all this evidence base was being built. And now that it is this top-down priority, suddenly these things are in a position to very rapidly get pulled into the regulation. So in this big government review, they called the Food for Life Served Here scheme offering a bridge to greater compliance with the reformed government buying standards. So the kind of key message here is that even if something's not the top-down priority, it's not on the political agenda, all of this work is not wasted. It's having a local impact, and it can very rapidly become a very scalable piece of work that can be done. I was at an event yesterday with a guy who worked in the UK government when they were when they were phasing out coal for the first time, and he kind of came up with this selection of things that need to happen for credible climate action to happen at a political scale, which is evidence is important, but it's not enough by its own. You also need social networks. You need campaigning. In food, you often get sort of celebrity chefs involved. And you need, crucially, this window of opportunity, right? So this stuff can be happening for 15 years with people really, really passionate about it before it suddenly gets its political window to drive climate action. And I think that's what I was sort of trying to get across at the very start of this talk, where I showed you the sort of scale of the people on the very front line to people at the United Nations. The big message is that it's important at every scale. Yeah, please. Please. So the question for those online is, this is a wonderful model if you've got the ability to have grassroots initiatives and voluntary initiatives. So really what I'd say there is you need civic spaces, right? You need both space to protest, but also space to experiment, space to try different things. I would take that criticism and agree with you, to be honest. I think the conveyor belt, it's kind of a mind map, if you like, for how things have sort of gotten done in Western context, I would say. It's by Thomas Hale, whose book I would very much recommend, from the Blavatnik School of Government. And I kind of agree with you, to be honest. I think that's why I had that slide earlier, because I think, you know, we're not just talking about climate. We could get into a debate of, you know, if you're in a sort of more top-down autocratic state where you can just plow things through, do you see more progress? Potentially, yes, in terms of specific, like, technical rollouts of things. But in order to see, I think that's the big message, is that this process is not perfect. This process is messy, and climate action from top to bottom and bottom to top is super messy. It's full of compromise, it's full of imperfection. But to me, this is the best system we have. And so I would say we need to protect the civic spaces and advocate for them. But yeah, I don't think the model does necessarily work. Yeah. So we need a sort of different mental model for how change gets driven in different contexts. Having said that, even in, you know, very autocratic countries, there are people sort of doing things. Yeah. But so what was really interesting, I was a COP, and it was the first COP in a while where loud protest has been permitted. And it does give it a different energy. It embeds accountability into the system in a way that I think you miss. But this is an international problem, right? Climate change is existential internationally. So yeah, not sure I answered that. I agreed with you. Okay, we're nearly there, I promise. And this is almost taking us back up in the final sort of few minutes of me talking, is coming back up with conflict into the international system. So we have this sort of quote in this public procurement review: we must meet our domestic and international legal obligations, in particular non-discrimination principle in WTO GPA and the Public Contracts Regulation 2015, which basically means exactly what the comment online earlier was. Well, similar to the comment online earlier. Governments are very tightly regulated on how they can spend their money. And there are sort of World Trade Organization agreements, which are designed to enable world trade, right? The priority for sort of buying local is something that's very high on the agenda, but actually does slightly run into certainly challenges to fit it into the international legal architecture that we developed. And the other thing is that most governments are based on this most economically advantageous tender. So they have to, by their legislation, by their design, which kind of trickles down from the international, provide best value for money. And this is kind of where this climate action is coming into slight tension, or finding niggly points along how it's trying to operate. But what I think is interesting about this is we had a quote saying, notably, the public contracts regulation already allows contracts below certain spending thresholds to be reserved for smaller suppliers, which presents opportunities for small to medium enterprises and public procurement. So, you know, this excuse that things can't be done legally is not insurmountable. It requires reform. So in the UK, the Procurement Act made this very subtle change in the legislation. Contracts no longer need to be the most economically advantageous tender, they now need to be the most advantageous tender. So that can incorporate a lot more elements of public value, right? And this kind of brings us up as a very final moment back to negotiating a setting course at the international level, where we sort of began this winding journey in the Paris Agreement. COPs have been going on, love them or loathe them. They're not stopping, and it was my first one, and this was the kind of work that I was taking there. And this Belém Declaration on Sustainable Public Procurement was a very exciting thing, and it was really being championed by the Brazilian government, who are doing a lot on using that public procurement. And so this was us with a bunch of ministers, and it was the most chaotic, hot, none of the toilets had doors on them, so you really got to know everyone experience. Did anyone see the fire? Yeah. Were you there? Wild, wasn't it? Yeah. And to be honest, very lucky that it wasn't worse, to be honest. The fire, you should watch a video online, it was wild. But the kind of key message that I'm trying to get at, and the takeaways of this, is that, you know, we need action at every single level. It's not perfect, it's messy, and I know I keep coming back to this, but embracing it and genuinely taking moments to listen to each other. As we're companies, we need to listen to, you know, companies from heavy industries. We need to listen to the energy industry. This question of if only 7% of companies are meeting their targets, is it the targets that are wrong, or is it the companies that are wrong? This is really important. As a government, you need to be saying, okay, we're trying to meet these long-term goals, but also people in the UK and sort of outside London basically haven't had a pay rise in 15 years. Like, these are very real, very prescient issues that are not going to be solved by just saying, this is our goal in 2050. We have to negotiate, and we have to really challenge ourselves to listen. And it really is a combination of bottom up and top down. And so, to finish on this quote, which Alexis loves, it's a magnificent time to be alive at a moment that matters so much. The question is, where will you guys fit in, and in what roles you're going to work in? How can you sort of bring some of these elements? Because there's no job that doesn't have. Thank you. I'm also very open to emails anytime. I know I'm kind of bombarded with super technical government and business stuff. Hope it is. Please. Uh-huh. Okay, please. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, I completely agree. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. 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 So those online, the question is basically cop good or bad. And this sort of process that we've developed, you're completely right. It is like a trade show. I had the exact same feeling. So when you're there, for those who don't know, it's kind of there's two zones. There's the blue zone, which is where the actual negotiations happen, and that's where um, all the people in suits and the delegates who managed to get a badge, that's where they exist. And you've got the green zone, which the Brazilian government, I'm right in saying they made it open to anyone who applied for a green zone badge, I think. Yeah. And the agri zone, yes, was very much agribusiness funded. That was a new thing. But sort of in the traditional COPs, you've got these two zones, the blue zone and the green zone. And you sort of walk in and it's like if you've ever been to a trade show or sort of like a university fair, and there are all these sort of tables with people with their sort of roll up banners saying, we're Uganda or we're the UK or we're scientists or we're the universities. And what's absolutely wild is that every single pavilion, which there are hundreds, have an entire roster of events, almost because they feel like they need to sort of justify themselves being there. And you'll go past some of these events, and like I spoke at a couple of events, and there are like 4 people in the audience. It's kind of a waste of time, my personal opinions. But the sort of magic happens, if you like, in the meetings that you have walking along the way. A very good friend of mine is in the Australian negotiation teams, which obviously had a lot on the on the cards this year. But she was so separate from the sort of COP I was existing at, which was also so separate from the COP that the people in the green zone were existing at. So I agree, finding a way for much better dialogue is essential. Um, One thing, actually, coming back to your point about what the international community can do, out of this COP, one thing that really can't get agreed on, which is remarkable when you understand the science of climate change, is this language around fossil fuel phase out, right? It's a very contentious thing with massive sort of implications for a lot of countries. Fossil fuel phase out is sort of fossil fuels are the entire economy of many countries. And so, you could see COP as a failure because it can't get this language in. But actually, out of COP, I think it was the Colombian and the Dutch governments. Yeah, so Colombia and the Netherlands have started this international treaty, sort of international community specifically looking at fossil fuel phase out. So you've got a lot of countries signing up to that. And so, there is progress there. It's coming out of the COP, but it's not what's in the COP. So it's kind of, again, it's very messy. Do you have, yeah, please. Okay, so what can individuals do in contexts where country levels don't have the capacity to spend money on climate change? Yeah, very good. I think something that I didn't touch on here because there was already so much content to cover is this this concept of the spheres of influence. So a company, yeah, I'm going to start with company, but it's going to translate onto the individual. A company has the actions they can do to reduce their carbon, right? And the same, an individual has the actions they can do to reduce their carbon. You know, you can eat more plant-based diet. We all sort of know what they are: fly less, etc. You know, it's not rocket science. Avoid rockets, basically. But you also have these wider spheres of influence. So this is a concept that we're applying to companies. Say, okay, but what other levers do you have? You know, once you've looked at your decarbonisation, you also have your political influence, right? You can advocate for or against climate policies. You have your financial portfolio. So where are you keeping your money? Where are you spending your money? And you also have your sort of public engagement. Who are you talking to about climate change, this kind of thing? And I think I'm saying that concept, so there's kind of the what you specifically do to reduce your carbon, but there's also the sort of impact you have that's a lot less kind of quantifiable. And I think as individuals, for sure, and I try to, there is an impact that you can have that's direct, you know, reduce your personal emissions. But let's also appreciate that we're all existing in a system, you know, like I drive a car that is petrol. I cannot afford an electric car yet. But I can vote for politicians who will sort of support that cost to come down for electric cars. Again, if you're in a country where you can't vote, that's what then becomes more difficult. But I think basically educating yourself, talking about it, and doing what you can whilst also living life. Hopefully the advice I'm trying to. Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. Okay, so the question is about if we focus on the kind of policies that are less political, basically, do we risk not solving the whole problem and being fragmented? Yes, definitely. And again, this is something I'm kind of formulating my thinking on because at this event, someone said like it is political. It's become political. Energy is political, and you know a lot of it is to do with energy. Energy policy is political. I think I'm going to slightly move sideways and then drag it back, but I think a big thing we need to solve is we use net zero as this kind of catch-all phrase to mean anything. Like a net zero company, to me that means nothing. Like what I really want to take away is net zero is this global physics atmospheric state at which global temperatures stop rising, if presuming we do it quickly enough without emitting too much. Everything else, the how to get there, like it is political, and we're always going to be fighting there. I think the biggest thing that I want to see is passing benefits genuinely onto consumers. So at the moment, our kind of electricity prices are set by the price of gas in the UK. Our electricity prices are one of the highest in the world because they're set by the price of gas. So there's a sort of policy reform where we can genuinely start passing that cost reduction. I think remembering and sympathizing that people are kind of fed up, people are struggling, and that is always going to be political. So I think it's not about bowing out of that sort of battle. I think the challenge is now of getting stuff done over the next couple of decades are significant, because it's always easier to scare people and sort of do the politics of, it's very easy to point out the problems as opposed to providing some solutions. So I think you have to carry on that. But I think what I'm trying to get at is there's so much we can do already and that we should be doing, and that really can sort of nudge those things in the right direction. That's everyone into science. Yeah, that's okay. Uh-huh. Please. Yeah. Yeah, great question. So me personally, all the sort of three. Okay, so me personally, I see myself having kind of three hats. So I have the sort of policy hat, which is, so I do research, but a lot of my work is engagement. So it's more kind of reports and policy briefs and enterprise briefs rather than sort of pure academic research. So a lot of the time they kind of sit side by side, but I work a little bit more on the, okay, how's a policymaker or someone, the CSO of Netflix, could read this and understand it. So with that in mind, I do the sort of policy stuff, which at the moment is focused on the public procurement work. But we kind of track policy, and so other people in the team do a lot more engagement with governments, a bit more on sort of setting carbon budgets, carbon policies, carbon taxes, this kind of thing. Then my business hat is I work with companies on this spheres of influence concept. So how to set a sort of net zero strategy that decarbonizes your stuff, but then goes one step further of sort of showing leadership across your industry. So we're doing a project with various companies, some of whom I've mentioned today, which is very exciting because the third hat is on the net zero standard. So my boss basically is in the ISO negotiations, and so I'm sort of producing the briefs for her that, you suddenly got Exxon saying, oh, actually we should count carbon like this, and so we suddenly need to understand everything there is to know about what they think in order to be able to rebuke it in negotiations, this kind of thing. And then in terms of Oxford Net Zero, honestly, so much. It's quite a weird. I don't know if you guys are at the university, but the whole governance of the university is befuddling to me. And basically, they like there are people that we do a lot of work on the net zero, so geological removals, both in terms of the technology of how to scale them, but also the sort of policy that needed to scale them up in time to sort of meet the demand that's going to be there in 2050, assuming we keep going on temperature goals. A lot of people do some stuff on like net zero nature, which is very interesting and an emerging thing in this sort of COP priority, the sort of synergies agenda. Yeah, loads of stuff. Yeah, if there are particular things people are interested in, I can point into the right person. Yeah. For the sort of net zero targets stuff, or you mean? Are you thinking about the university in particular? Yeah. Yeah. So specific to the university, there is, I only discovered this a few weeks ago, but there is this website called like Find an Expert, which is basically university people who work on particular topics. Ah, sorry, I see. So the university estates team do have sort of responsibility for what the university is actually doing. And there is a top heel who basically is setting sort of climate strategy of the university. Again, that's slightly separate to the colleges, because obviously Oxford University has to be exception. Sorry, I work for the university. But in terms of organisation, honestly, the way I go about it, because I have to do this quite a lot for sort of outreach for interviews, is I find someone who seems open, I email them and I ask them, which I know is not like a very, yeah, yeah, yeah. I think, yeah, I would say in terms of the sort of climate stuff, the chief sustainability officer, or often you'll be able to find authors who have written a company's like sustainability reports, and they're often a good place to start. But yeah, you have to do so much digging. It's not very techy or data-y. Um, yeah, maybe it should be. Yeah. Yeah, and actually interestingly, one sec, I know we're at time. In some of the kind of guidance, there is this idea about basically having the C-suite, which is like CEO, the CSO, the CFO, like chief financial officers and stuff of companies, being accountable for the sustainability strategies, which I think is quite an important step, because often you'll speak to a chief sustainability officer of like a massive company, and you find that they've got like two people in a room that's 3 miles away from the sort of head office, right? So the actual where the power lies isn't necessarily where the titles lie. So yeah. But if they want to work in company sustainability kind of thing. Okay, so if people want to work in climate, basically, come to the School of Climate Change, obviously, number one. I think there are a few, I mean, without sounding too twee, every job is a climate job. Every job is a climate. Every job has sort of avenues that if you're sort of proactive with, like look at where the company, it's crying out for people to be proactive. And I mean, I mean this, like all of this stuff can only happen because people are taking initiative and saying, okay, how can we make this a little bit better? In terms of actual work, I think there's so many free opportunities to educate yourself on sort of specific things. And also everyone is always happy to give their time. So if there's kind of an avenue that you're particularly interested in, once you can find who they are, email them and see what their suggestions are. Because everyone, in my experience, who works in the space, even if you have wildly different perspectives on, carbon credits, food, buying local, buying international, etc., etc., like we're generally working towards a common goal, and people are pretty open. So, yeah, but I'd say amazing. Thank you. Yeah.